أهلا وسهلا بكم في حلقة جديدة من بودكاست منور، حيث نسير معا من عالم الصور العابرة والكلام المسطح إلى عالم أعمق وأنجع وأجدر. Thank you for joining us for a new episode of Minwar Podcast, where we move from a world of short messages, passing images and shallow words to a world longing for what is deeper, worthier and more wholesome. سوف يجري الحوار في هذه الحلقة باللغة الإنجليزية. This episode's conversation will be conducted in English. قبل أن نبدأ هذا الحوار أرجو منكم أن تنشروا هذه الحلقة مع من قد يهمه موضوعنا، وأن تتابعونا على الإنستغرام والأبل بودكاست واليوتيوب أو أي المنصات التي تنصتون عبرها هذا البودكاست. Before we commence this conversation, be sure to share this episode with your friends and anyone who may be interested in the topic, and follow us on Instagram, YouTube and Apple Podcasts or any other platform you use to tune into your favorite podcasts. In this episode, we host Dr. Noora Lori. Dr. Noora is an assistant professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies, Boston University. She's the founding director of the Pardee School Initiative on Forced Migration and Human Trafficking, which she co-directs with Professor Kaiha Shilde. She was previously an Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies, a fellow at the International Security Program of the Harvard Kennedy School, and a visiting scholar at the Dubai School of Government. She received her PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University, and her dissertation received the Best Dissertation Award from the Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association in 2014. Her book, Offshore Citizens: Permanent Temporary Status in the Gulf, received the Best Book Prize from the Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association. As citizens of our countries and citizens of the world and global society, it can be hard to imagine how the world became organized the way it is today. This was not always the norm. How did this current nation-state system and the world borders come to be? And consequently, what defines our citizenry? How are we affected by the policies that govern our geographical borders? And how does all of that relate to the prevalent immigration trends around the world? How are these borders and relationships tied to economic systems and control? Are there ways of conceiving the world other than the current nation-state border drawing system? Can we imagine and conceive a new world? Dr. Noora, we're very pleased and honored to have you with us in this episode, so thank you for accepting the invitation to be on Minwar Podcast.
It's an honor. Thank you for having me.
Great. So, Dr. Noora, when we think about the countries that we live in, the nations that we live in, when we think about kind of our citizenry and kind of the questions and the ideas we posed at the beginning, this system is quite complex. I mean, if we want to travel, we need to have like passports, we need to have a book. There's like security checks, there's different kinds of checks. You know, are you planning to travel to stay there? Are you planning to just visit, business, what have you? It's a whole kind of like system with all these intricacies and so if we take a few steps back, one wonders, how did this thing come about? Like, how did this modern nation state come into existence?
Yeah, wonderful. Huge question.
Right.
I think that some historians will periodize the emergence of nation states with the Treaty of Westphalia, 17th century. I'm of the branch of the historians who actually think of nation states as a political invention that emerges in Western Europe much later in the 1880s, late 19th century, in the sense that prior to that, you don't really have the infrastructure for developing this idea of a nation that makes sense to individuals, where people are speaking the same language, where you somehow try to convince them and they start to believe that there's that they have something in common with people they've never met who live thousands of miles away. And for me, I really, I take kind of a political economy approach to this, where it's a political invention that has much to do with the way we exert power. First, in terms of, taking the Weberian understanding of the state, who monopolizes the legitimate use of violence. And then I really appreciate John Torpey's work, The Invention of the Passport, where he says it's not just about, who monopolizes the legitimate use of violence. It's really about, is there an infrastructure for determining who moves and who stays, and how to document people. And so for him, it's about who monopolizes the legitimate movement, authorization over movement. And for that, we're talking about migration control. Really, the first passports emerged for emigration control, to keep people from leaving. And it's only later that we start to develop the kinds of entry controls. So it's a long-winded answer to say, this is a political invention. It begins in Western Europe. It travels to other parts of the world. It's not organic to any part of the world. There's no such thing as a nation that we can point to from time immemorial, even though that's what every nationalist history tells us, is that we are one nation, we are people, we can trace our lineage. That's part of the political invention. That's part of the fiction that is required in order to develop this kind of political system, political technology.
So you mentioned that this system or the invention of passports, rather, I just want to quickly touch on that, was actually developed to keep people in. Yeah. Why was that important?
There's so many reasons why. Capital flight. You don't want people to take money out. There's a whole narrative about exit as being a way of protesting. So leaving certain states. Also, capturing. It's counterintuitive from the way that we're thinking about it now, but modern states are all about settling mobile populations. Settlement is not necessarily natural to humans. Migration is more natural. Movement is more natural. But in order to exert power, you need to know where they're located. You need to have a standard naming system, a standard identity management system to fight wars, conscription, education. All of these things, actually, all of those mechanisms of power require people to remain settled. And so when we start to see the emergence of this system, it's really much more about keeping people where they are. And then now where it's all about kind of keeping people out. Right. But I like that you mentioned that there's different kinds of visas, different kinds of infrastructures, and I think that's what's so interesting is that migration control or migration enforcement is not just about preventing people from coming. Sometimes you want to speed up movement for the high net worth individuals of the world, for the tourists who want to spend money. So it's really about regulating movement and mobility more broadly, rather than necessarily restricting, whether it's emigration or immigration.
Got it. So when I reflect on what you're saying now, and you also mentioned that you also look at this from a political economy standpoint, a lot of what you mentioned has to do with money, with economics. So can you elaborate more on that? Like, how does that really tie into kind of these lines that we draw on a map and whatnot?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I would say that's not the only way to look at it. I think that if you talk to cultural historians, to anthropologists, they'd be answering this question in a very different way about how people's consciousness changes, how societies change. And I'm not saying that those kind of other layers don't matter, but I think that I tend to be materialist. I think that when it comes down to it, we see these political systems emerge for things like extracting taxation, and taxation is a big one. In fact, much of the kind of citizenship by investment schemes and other schemes that we've seen are really about capturing people's income or evading any given state's capturing of your income. And so, we have a different kind of system here because we don't have income tax. And so in each location, the political economy is different. But I think that you really have to think about how the money moves. And also, that's why the political and the security aspect is part of it. Also, who has the legitimate use of violence? Who as authority do you need permission from? And if you look at old passports, they're fascinating. Our passports, when you look at what it actually says, it's a sovereign vouching for you as an individual. I wish I brought my Bahraini passport so we could actually read it. But even the older passports would say, grant safe passage. A passport is meaningless if there's no sovereign who's recognizing you to say this person is who they say they are. Someone has to legitimate your identity as an individual. And increasingly, if you don't have those documents, you can't do anything. Not only can you not move, but you can't register children, you can't get access to healthcare, you can't get access to education. So documents, for me, that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. That's where nation states become really real, is when we start to develop these identity management infrastructures that connect documents to a whole system of checking IDs internally and externally.
There's a few things you mentioned there that we're going to begin unpacking and unfolding. So you mentioned the words violence and sovereignty. So a couple of things come to mind here. First of all, when reading, looking into history and looking at this topic, we find that there's a very kind of, something very obvious that pops up, is that violence has always been used to establish states. And that's, kind of like, violence is an abhorrent act. Like, why would that be a legitimate way of establishing a state? And why is that so, natural and kind of accepted as part of this nation-state building kind of mechanism?
Violence, the use of violence is so central to the exertion of power, right? But there's different forms of violence. Not every nation state has the same kind of state formation process. Some are, bloodier than others. Some start with revolution. Some start with conquest. Other times you have kind of more institutional violence, or where you're erasing the existence of smaller identities, more local identities, and eliminating those cultural forms in order to create this new kind of homogenous nation. So the violence can unfold in different ways, and it's not always about blood. But I think that the use of violence is so critical to peace and war. And by peace, I mean, there's a really fascinating article or chapter by Charles Tilly, who's an amazing kind of social scientist, it's called War Making and State Making. And he makes the argument, looking at Italy, that actually we should understand modern states as effectively the growth of these kinds of mafia networks, that essentially what modern states are doing are saying, you pay me to protect you. And so I think that there's a sense in which we need that, right? Otherwise, potentially your own security would have to be decentralized and privatized. And so being part of a political entity also means that you have a police force, you have a military, you're part of a larger community where violence is, the monopolization of violence is a really critical part of that. And when it's done well, you don't feel the violence. When it's done well, that's peace, that's quiet, right? But it's the things we take for granted. And I think that what you see is that when it's kind of like privilege, right? When, if you have the privilege, you don't see it. So if you're secure, you don't really think about security. It's only when you see these moments of insecurity where we really start to pay attention to who controls the security apparatus. Is there a kind of shifting kind of political struggle around that? But when it's monopolization of violence is done well, and there's a kind of acceptance and legitimacy to it, we don't really think about it. So I don't know if that completely answers your question.
What I also wanted to ask about, which, and it's, again, this is unpacking your previous statement, was sovereignty. What does sovereignty even mean?
Such a difficult question. Such a simple question, a difficult question. Because in the simple form, it's about, an authority who's exerting power. What are the sources of sovereignty? At a certain point, the sovereignty or gaining kind of legitimacy has to come from people, right? You have to accept that this entity has power over you. On the other hand, we also know that sovereignty is very much externally imposed, in the sense that if you recognize a leader or a group as being, your rightful sovereign who's kind of vouching for you, but other states don't, then it's meaningless. And so it's this kind of dialectic or tension between the internal understandings of who has the right to rule, and whether from the outside external actors view that right to rule as being, or that particular entity as being, a legitimate political entity that has autonomy. And so I think with sovereignty there's also this idea of autonomy. We can get into it, but I don't think there's any real autonomous state, right? It's a very interconnected system. That's the idea of sovereignty, is both from inside and from external.
Okay, and tying to that, you also mentioned something earlier, which was so there's this idea that, okay, you pay me to protect you. Like, who's you, who's me? What are the players that we're talking about in this dynamic?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why, look, when we periodize where does this political invention of the state kind of emerge, really the focus is on Western Europe. And there's a kind of narrative that I think has been really undermined by, or challenged by post-colonial scholars that say, so the narrative is this is something that emerges in the West, that nation states are political technology that are there, and then it gets exported to other parts of the world. I don't think that you can really get the sense of how we, the people, emerges without an understanding of the sort of European engagements with the rest of the world and the colonies, right? And so even this idea of who we, the people, are, comes, the height of modern nationalism is also the height of imperialism. It's about creating the opposition of who's not the people. And not only do I mean in the sense of we're not counting these people as part of the same nation state. I mean that, we have a really long history and I think a sordid history of human history of really questioning whether all human beings are the same species. Going back to Carl Linnaeus, who's the kind of the father of taxonomy, if you look at his taxonomy of the human species, he believed there are four. There were these debates, that scientific racism between the polygynists and the monogynists. The polygynists were arguing that, human beings are multiple species. The monogynists were saying they're one species. And you don't classify for no reason, right? So if you look back to Linnaeus and other kind of classifications of craniometry, measuring people's heads, it's the idea of like, well, if, this species is inferior in the sense that they're lazy inherently, and so they must be enslaved, right? Or this species is, even when it's not using that scientific language, it can be a civilizational critique, right? That you just don't have the history or the knowledge in order to produce your own, how to use your own resources, and so we're going to extract them from you and kind of develop you, right? So if you look at, for example, the French Empire versus the British Empire, different narratives. In one narrative, you'll never be equal. The people from the colonies will never quite be equal, and that's in the British narrative. In the French narrative, it's not that you're inherently naturally inferior. It's just that you don't have the history, you don't have the civilization, and so we must civilize you. And this narrative, it's not just about language, right? These kinds of ideologies have real effects, and that are deeply connected to the production of modern states, and who gets to be part of we, and who's the us, and who's the other. So yeah, it's I can't remember what the original question was. This is typical professor, so please redirect me if that's not the direction you want to go. But
I think that's great. That's great because you're touching on a topic I was hoping to touch on later. But so let's continue on this. But let me ask it with let me bring in another layer and see how we can fold the two together. So how did the modern nation state come to our region? Like, what was here? I guess this has many kind of multiple legs, so to speak. So on one level, I'm kind of wondering, what was the world like kind of before that? And I mean, okay, we read it in history books, but what was it really like compared to what we now know today, kind of? And then perhaps we can look at that in our region more closely, but also where the modern nation state comes. And then it seems to me from what you mentioned is that in a way, the development and the kind of the spread of the modern nation state system of this kind of like line drawings and all that, it's as if it was a way of kind of dividing wealth or saying, okay, this piece is yours, that piece is mine, and this is how we occupy this territory, this is how we occupy that territory. So how does that, that seems like a purely colonial project right there.
Yeah, it is and it isn't, right? I think that your question is so rich, so I have so many different answers to it.
Yeah,
I will say, okay, let's go back to sort of different theories of formation of nation states, what matters. Hobsbawm, who's a historian, says, if you're going to look analytically at nation states, don't look for nations, look for nationalism. Look for social movements, who's driving, who wants to create this ideal of a nation combined with an infrastructure of a state. So there's a big bottom-up narrative here too, and I've been talking kind of the top-down narrative. When we look at someone like Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, he argues that modern nation states emerge, they don't make sense until you have print capitalism, because the idea is that you have to have a medium of communication that starts, a mass communication that starts to make people feel that they're part of a larger community, right? I like this idea of imagined community, but I think there's also a time lag between when map makers and actually even individuals start to imagine themselves as part of a community, and when political entities have the infrastructure to actually make those borders real and those identities real. So that's broader. I think when you're looking, if you take someone like Anderson and then we apply that argument to the Arab world, Arab nationalism, the kind of fire behind Arab nationalism, radio and Sawt al-Arab and these modes of communication that start to make people feel that there is this larger entity that we are a part of, that it's an Arab nation, that it gets articulated in different parts of the Arab world. Of course, this narrative is also problematic because we're erasing all of the non-Arab ethnicities that are part of our world also. And so you start to notice within even the Arab world, you have such different routes towards the production of modern states and modern nation states. Obviously, in the Gulf, our formation is much later, in 1970s. Mandate system, after the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, you have the emergence of these series of treaties. So we think of, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. There's a really funny story that historians tell about the formation of Jordan. I don't know if people may not like this story, but it's in James Galvin's Modern Middle East book, and so I like teaching it. And where, just to show kind of how arbitrary some of these borders were, where if you look at the map of Jordan, there's like for no reason, there's kind of a triangle. There's no mountain or river or anything that is on the terrain that would make sense for that triangle, and
or
so
people who are occupying
right. Yeah. No, and so it's called what Galvin calls it is Churchill's hiccup. And the idea was that Churchill liked his whiskey, and one day after lunch, after partaking a glass of whiskey, when they were drawing these maps, he hiccuped. And I whether that's actually true, it remains to, I don't actually know.
But it speaks to the arbitrary nature of some of these. It speaks
to the arbitrary nature and the way in which our territories, our people, were treated as spoils of war, not for ourselves to determine our own boundaries or whether those boundaries are of the state, of the territory, or even of the nation, but this idea that powers control territories and that they can bargain over them. And so I think that there's, Israel and Palestine, and there's a lot of continued effects of this kind of mandate system in that part of the Arab world. There's a ISIS documentary that Vice has where there's a great snippet where they show ISIS leaders bulldozing the border between Iraq and Syria and saying, we're getting rid of Sykes-Picot. So now different terrorist organizations, insurrectionists can take this narrative of colonial, that these aren't real nation states because colonies kind of built them. I think that that's also problematic. Just because something is a political invention doesn't mean it doesn't become real. And I think that when we say nation states are constructed, doesn't mean that we don't feel nationalism. It doesn't mean we don't feel patriotism. you just have to acknowledge that this isn't something that's natural from time immemorial. And I do think that in terms of thinking about the other parts of the Middle East, the Gulf has done very well. And, you know, the system that we had, the British were quite concerned with the route to India. In fact, the whole idea of the Middle East, when we're trying to periodize when this language, this terminology even emerges.
The region,
right, comes also from Alfred Mahan's naval war documents after World War II. There was a Middle East Command. And, you know, who's in the middle if we're the Middle East? How do we count time today? Greenwich, you know. So it's not like people in the Far East look up and say, oh, we're in the Far East, right? So it's all in comparison to who has control, right? Who's monopolized control at a particular point in time. And so the formation of these states is deeply intertwined with imperial expansion and breakdown, whether it's the Safavid Empire, the Ottoman Empire, or British Empire, French Empire. Bahrain has a rich history among multiple different empires. And so, again, this is not to say that our nation state and borders don't matter, that nationalism isn't real. It's just to point out all of the different ways that nation states emerge. And I think that in some ways it's kind of like, you know, when you're thinking about the export of a good, a car, it doesn't shed its contents when you're crossing a border. Mm-hmm. A car exported from Japan to Bahrain remains a car. And I think we kind of expect that same kind of coherence to a political technology when really the only thing that remains the same is the outside facade, that, you know, there's a political entity that rules, there's a national flag. These dressings of nationalism are the same. The way it emerges, whether from the top down, from the bottom up, whether it was bloody, whether it was quite peaceful, really, we have as many different modes of the emergence of nation states as there are nation states.
Okay, I mean, when we also talk about nation states today, you know, just doing a quick kind of look over the internet, even at articles and even what happens in our world today with, you know, people like, I don't know, Trump and kind of his branch of political thinking, if that's the right word to use. And those who follow that kind of more nationalist tendencies, that's kind of looked down upon today, you know, by a large number of people. And so there's kind of a contradiction that, if, you know, emerges with nationalism. That on one hand, you know, we're very, you know, involved in identity making around this nation, which in itself is not a natural construction. It's something that we've kind of put together. We've developed through radio, as you mentioned, in the Arab world, or with print, or what have you, you know, with flags and systems and all that, and all this infrastructure. But also there's this kind of weariness of, well, you know, you're seen as being a limited person, kind of in discourses of a higher level, if you think like that and you embrace that. So what's happening there?
Yeah, I think that's a really deep question. I mean, I don't think we can eliminate or discount the feelings of people who vote for people like Trump. And it's not just Trump, right? There's this emergence of kind of strongman leadership. And for me, that emergence of nativism and nationalism is also a kind of desire for security, a desire of a way of minimizing uncertainty. And, you know, so you have, in academic circles, that's kind of looked down upon in many ways, where the narrative is much more about it being interconnected with different parts of the world. The scientific community is necessarily global. The production of knowledge, production of science is necessarily global. But I don't think we can eliminate this kind of knee-jerk reaction of really wanting to make sense of what's going on and the kinds of insecurities that actually have a lot to do with the consolidation of late capitalism, right? I mean, I haven't mentioned it yet, but it's absolutely really critical to both the nation-state system and to I think the rising inequalities that make people want to have rules for managing scarcity. And who should I share? Who should I be obliged to share my resources with? And that's actually what documents do. That's what things like citizenship versus non-citizenship do. They manage scarcity. They create rules of the game for who should have access to what rights, under which conditions, who should have access to permanent residency, and for how long, right? I think that, again, we can't discount as this is just ignorance. I think there is a kind of a human desire to try to make the chaos around us more palatable, to try to kind of come up with rules for deciding how to manage scarcity, and also who to blame when you feel like your jobs are being lost. And instead of blaming, the multinational corporations that are actually evading taxes in multiple jurisdictions, that are increasing the amounts that are going to the holders of capital. So, I can't remember the last time I was looking at this, it was something like, I don't want to say a wrong statistic, but an incredible amount of wealth is monopolized by 1% of the population of the earth, right? And so instead of it's much harder to blame a system. It's much harder to blame a structure. It's much easier to develop scapegoats. Well, it's these immigrants who've come in, who've taken our jobs. And that's actually, we see that kind of cycle happening over and over again, where there's no kind of urbanization without movement, without migration. We need it for any kind of construction, any kind of, small tangent. One of my colleagues at BU, he's an archaeologist, gave a fascinating presentation on an ancient Mexican city, and he was saying, this was the migrant housing. So I was thinking, how can you know that this area belonged to migrants for a period before which we even have textual evidence? And he said that basically what the archaeologists can do is there's this element strontium, which is in the water we drink, and it circulates in your body, but it imprints your teeth. And so if you see a skeleton where the strontium level in the teeth is different from the rest of the body, that person is moved, because it's different. That element is different in different locations.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
And so we actually know that from the earliest cities, people moved, right? And yet we see the same kind of, the minute we've developed the resources we want, we start blaming those individuals and scapegoating them and wanting them out. And so I think that there's a tension there that's not just about this moment, but again, it's really hard to place blame on something that's structural, where you can't see the forces, right? And it's much easier, especially when you have politicians who harp on that. Modi, there's so many right now. Bolsonaro, right? And they emerge at a particular, there's a kind of a wave towards populism and towards the romanticization of people who are saying it like it is. Well, they're giving you binary black-white understandings of the world that are a way of minimizing uncertainty, and that's why they're so seductive.
So, in terms of how we identify ourselves as a people. Right. So today we think of being, say, Bahraini, or being, like Indian or Japanese or what have you. But how did people before these lines were drawn identify themselves? Like what was it like to be of a larger entity?
I think that even if you look at our region, right, tribes, family networks. I think networks are probably, if we were going to, try to generalize, and really thinking about networks as being much more important in terms of how people self-identified. And then more local, regional identities, which there's still that tension, right? Because producing something like a nation state often means suppressing those alternate identities and wanting to erase them. And anyone who's interested in this, I think Peasants into Frenchmen, Eugene Weber's book, it's this huge, beautiful book, a historian about the production of modern France, where he really talks about in the 1880s, all of the reforms that made modern France into what it is, and what it required was, you exert control by having a common language. You also have to produce this idea of a consciousness where there's a patrie, there's a larger motherland, fatherland. And people need to believe that if they're going to start dying in wars for you, So there's a really important kind of political need for this kind of changing of consciousness, but it also came through the forced elimination of other languages, other identities. Women's education during that period was very much about changing the mother tongue. So it wasn't necessarily for progressive means. It was really for, again, consolidating power, right?
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, that's why I'm so materialist about these about these questions. But so I think that there were so many other ways of kind of identifying. And even if you look at different family networks that are from our part of the world, you can have the same family that's here in Saudi, in Qatar, in Kuwait, in India, in East Africa, in Oman. And I really like the work of Indian Ocean historians. Actually, Fahad Bishara, who's a Kuwaiti academic historian, has a beautiful book on Sea of Debt that looks at, when he does his fieldwork, he doesn't just look at Kuwait, he looks at Kuwait and Mumbai and Zanzibar. And you really start to think about, well, people's identities, they were circulating, and so the territory wasn't what you necessarily kind of identified with. You had movement of people was much more common, and so the forms of identification change when we start to develop this idea of, kind of not just idea, but the mechanisms for settling populations and kind of codifying these lines on the ground. So I think, networks in particular, not just family networks, but other kinds of networks and on a regional, local level were much more important. Of course, you have empires also. And so in some ways, nation-state system is bigger, and it's also smaller than other previous forms of political organization or political entities.
And bigger in what sense? Smaller in what sense?
So, smaller than empires, right?
Okay. Just in size?
Yeah, and in size and in terms of, like, if you think about the Ottoman Empire, there was a lot of heterogeneity that was part of that system. And so different languages, different rules for different parts of the empire, kind of local control. And when you see, the kind of attempts for the Ottoman Empire to really compete with the West, with the Tanzimat reforms and other reforms, the idea was that, okay, well, we can't really control this huge swath of territory if people are speaking different languages, if there isn't a kind of common system. And so we have to have a kind of centralized command and control, and we're going to try to create kind of uniform rules, uniform language, etc., which backfires, right? And the Ottoman Empire eventually breaks down. So there's different ways of organizing political communities, and I think in that sense the nation state is kind of smaller. In other sense, it's bigger than the regional or local identities that were so critical. And of course, religious, kind of what is the form of identification that makes you feel like you have a connection with someone else? Religion played a huge role in that, in going back to the Crusades, but even before, of how do we think of our community? Who is part of that community? Who's the we? Who's the they? Nation states kind of supplant that, not entirely. There's still a tension with those alternative identities, but in that sense, again, it's bigger and smaller.
To kind of take this idea a little further, a few years ago I went to Zanzibar, and I think we talked about this before.
Yeah, I want to go
briefly. Yeah, you should. And it was a very interesting experience for me in the sense that, so here I am on this island, like off the east coast of Africa, right? That walking through Stone Town in some ways felt like walking through, Manama, or kind of like old Manama, what's left of the constitutional framework of the planning, right? And you could see folks there we went around like Eid time, so you could see folks there dressed in, you know, thobes, kind of dashdasha, you know, and you know, colorful, similar to the way the Omanis kind of do it, because they kind of ruled there as well, obviously, for centuries. And yet they pride themselves in kind of being very tolerant and very accepting and kind of very forgiving, if that's the right word. And even the word tolerant doesn't really cut it, because tolerance means that you have something that I don't like that I'm tolerating, right? That I'm kind of exercising patience. But I think the vibe there, and it's kind of the vibe that it's a vibe similar to, you know, the only other time I remember, you know, feeling that sense was maybe when I went to Hajj, like, what was that, like 10 years ago or something, or more? No, it must have been more. And so I wonder, like, you know, is there a system? Is there a layer? You know, is there a system of identifying that doesn't necessarily suppress, or that exercises less suppression, where where people are unified? Like, you know, we had this kind of, we use these words sometimes in Bahrain or other places, or like brother.
Yeah.
And you'd call someone a brother who you share a certain, let's say, ideological position with. In our case, that's more commonly used in, say, you know, in the context of Islam, like someone's a Muslim or something. Yeah. So I wonder, was the world before the nation state a bit more brotherly, a bit more closer? Were these networks that you speak of, were they a bit more, again, I don't like the word, but were they a bit more tolerant, accepting?
I don't think so, actually. I mean, you know, again, it's a really thoughtful question. And again, I think that one of my anthropologist colleagues would probably answer it, or actually even historian colleagues would answer it very differently. I think that we see just different lines that are drawn. Again, when you're thinking about members of a community, it comes down also to how you're managing scarcity, how you're not just sharing resources but developing them, how you're dealing with the issue of security. And so I don't think I don't want to necessarily romanticize, as critical as I am of the nation state system in many ways, I don't necessarily want to romanticize something that came before it. I mean, because we know that empires were incredibly violent in their own right. I think like the connection with Zanzibar is so important, and one thing we don't talk about enough is how recent we've had slavery in this part of the world, you know, and how from pearling to date agriculture, these were incredibly labor-intensive industries. And much of that was driven by slave labor, right? And so I again, when you talk to historians, there's kind of a narrative that slavery in the Islamic world was, more tolerant or more civilized in some ways than like transatlantic slavery. Certainly, Johann Matthew has this, he's a historian, has this really interesting work on why it was so difficult to eliminate slavery in our part of the world. And part of it was that the British would come and try to seize ships, and they kept expecting it to look like transatlantic slavery. So they expected to see slaves in shackles at the bottom of these ships, and instead they didn't even realize that, it was actually the crew, and that slavery looked a lot more like human trafficking. And then even with abolition, what ends up happening to these people ends up being like human trafficking. And so I think the inequality was deeply intertwined with these alternative ways of organizing the world too. And so and that in some ways that even though we certainly have not gotten rid of racism, I think that the fact that there's a kind of consensus that slavery is bad is progress for us humans. I mean, still continues, right? There's all forms of modern slavery. But I don't necessarily want to romanticize those earlier periods in which we had the height of scientific racism, and we had very well-established large commercial industries that that involved forced labor, right?
Okay, so the axis of your critique is slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
right.
one possible axis of that critique.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah,
sorry.
no, because the reason I mentioned this also is because, I mean, when, you know, and we mentioned this before on this podcast in other episodes, because I think it's a very important question. Like when we think of, you know, when America wants to propagate itself around the world culturally or exercising, you know, cultural power and all that, it always says that we're a country for everyone who wants to work hard and believes in freedom and the ideas of, you know, democracy and, you know, all kind of the things that we know about that have been spread by America, that we know about America, right? Now, regardless of whether they're true or not, that's a separate story in the context of our conversation. But what I'm trying to say is that identification is not about a geographic boundary.
Yeah.
At least in this narrative. It's not about, well, today at least, it's not about a certain skin color or language or whatnot, because even, you know, America doesn't have an official language as part of that kind of thinking, even though in practice it's different, yeah. So that ideological position must have power for it to be used to propagate the system, right? To propagate its culture and economic reach and economic power and whatnot, right? That's the contradiction that I find in the nation state system. It's as if human intuition is post kind of settlement in terms of identity. It's post geographical, so to speak. But I don't know. That's kind of what I'm thinking now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's kind of, I want to take your question in two directions.
Right.
I think it's a really deep one. Okay, so on this point of like, what is the soft power of the United States, that I think commercial power is a really big part of that, right? So goods, also the spread of, you know, U.S. media, U.S. films, music, that's a really important part of its sort of what makes it attractive. And that's when we think about soft power. If hard power is I exert power over, A exerts power over B because of the threat of violence, and, you know, soft power is through attraction, not through coercion. You're exerting power through attraction rather than coercion. So I think the commercial power is really important in that narrative. Obviously, the narrative of we the people and this idea that we the people can be anyone is also a very powerful narrative. I think historically, though, especially if you work on citizenship, you realize that, of course, who was counted as a person really shifts, right? And I'm not just talking about, let's not forget, this country is also built on the genocide of one people, the enslavement of another, right? And even this idea of like, I mean, who could get citizenship under law for the majority of U.S. history from 1790 to the Immigration Nationality Act of 1952, you had to be white. And there's some wonderful books. I mean, what's beautiful, I think, about the U.S. system is really this ability to freedom of speech, right? The production of all of this knowledge, of critical knowledge about the U.S. nation and what that's actually meant. So we have all of this evidence towards it. And so, you know, naturalization was tied to whiteness. Whiteness emerges, again, for very specific reasons. It's not something that is just, the first time we see, I wish I had my notes because I lecture on this, but the first time we see white instead of a European categorization, Germans, Italian, whatever, yeah, Germans, Irish, etc., was in relation to anti-miscegenation laws and anti-miscegenation laws. So laws that prevented intermarriage from whites and blacks. It was either anti-miscegenation laws or land use property laws, right? So again, we don't put humans in classifications for no reason. It always has to do with, there's always a reason for creating classifications between human beings. And I think that democracies from very early on, going back to ancient Athens. Not only was there, a slavery as part of ancient Athens, there was also Dimitra Kasimis, who's a political theorist at the University of Chicago, has some really interesting work on this, but she looks at the medics, who are foreign residents, who are part of Athens but weren't enfranchised to vote, right? And so from the very early formations of this idea of we the people, there was always kind of an asterisk of who could count as the people. And I think that's their liberal strategies of exclusion, their autocratic, authoritarian strategies of exclusion, where you're saying, this strategy of exclusion is simply you cannot be part of us, you will never be part of us. Or another strategy might be that we are the people, but you don't quite qualify, right? And I think that Uday Mehta has a beautiful essay on this, where he talks about the role of children and how colonial people who were colonized were kind of put in that same branch of this idea that, that's why until you're 18 you can't vote, because you don't have the rationality or the consciousness or the capability for democratic deliberation, right? And colonial people from the colonies were sort of treated in the same way, or African Americans or Native Americans, of just not having that capacity. And so I live there. I see, again, the ability. People don't stop me and say, are you a foreigner? No one actually asked me that. So that's something that's, I think, very different than Bahrain, where we have a very, very cosmopolitan understanding. I mean, we're very open. We share this land with so many different people, and I think that there's really a love there. But there isn't a sense of, we don't necessarily...
Unless you're in New York, to be honest.
Yeah. But there isn't a sense of like, you all are Bahrainis, right? The idea of like what it means to be Bahraini is still very much more tied to a sense of blood, family, especially because we're a very small country, right? So who are you related to? How are you connected? And I think that there's a broader sense there that you can be American with any kind of background. I think what we saw last Wednesday at the Capitol, what we've seen with this emergence of the Trump campaign, which always had, white nationalism always had its antecedents, really shows that the struggle hasn't been resolved, right? And in fact, it's kind of like these tensions are growing higher and higher, and this desire of like who gets to be American and who's all American is part of that narrative that shows this kind of friction. But yeah,
I want to go a little deeper into this because I think what I'd like to know is, so again, I'm just gonna try and rephrase the question in a different way. When America exerts its soft power, right, its cultural influence, it focuses a lot on these non-material ideas. And this is my hypothesis, right, that regardless of what it actually practices in action, which is what you said, like, whether it's about whiteness or levels of whiteness, Northern Europeans are supposedly, in that kind of thinking, intellectually higher than Southern Europeans, and then, those who are Middle Eastern are at the bottom of the level, because we're also, I guess, Caucasian, white in that respect. So what I'm saying is that there's a power to non-material ways of identification, of nation building. And by nation here, I don't mean the nation state, but of building a collective.
Yeah.
Right? Try to use academic words here. A collective, imaginary.
Political community.
Okay. There are, and those non-material ways appear to be more powerful, more noble, if that's the right word, and so with the nation-state system, there's so much more to be desired, because as we mentioned earlier, like even what you mentioned is like in academic circles, nationalism and nativism, not very popular.
Yeah.
Yes, we try to understand these phenomena, but we look at them as phenomena, as like, oh, what's up here, right?
Yeah.
But those ideals that we talk about, although they're very real and used to propagate, influence or expand influence, nations are not built on that, right? That what does it mean to be, I don't know, like Japanese, right? I mean, there's a bunch of stereotypes, and sometimes those stereotypes are perhaps even more powerful than lineage and physical, kind of physical appearance, because, again, they're non-material, and there's a standard or an expectation that you're asked to live up to. There are values, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that is there a world where, aren't we in conflict between a system of identification through values versus a system of identification through what the current system is, through lines and borders? And this becomes even more interesting with the advent of the internet, right? 10 years ago, the internet was a thing that we used. Today, the internet is everything, and then there's everything else, right? It's real, it's life. Where really borders and all these things are kind of like erased, and it's just open society, open world. That's the idea, at least. And so I guess what I'm trying to build up here is that there seems to be a critical error in the nation state system that every so often we find itself trying to correct itself. And we live in an era where you have corporations that are more powerful than some countries. I was reading somewhere that Apple's capital worth is more than like the Bank of England's reserves and whatnot. So how do we resolve these conflicts of nations, yet a world where companies are multinational and beyond nations, and a world where you no longer have colonization in its original sense, where you have the internet, a power that is erasing lines in many respects? So I guess my hypothesis, so to speak, is it seems more natural for us to develop our collective identities over value, through values, as opposed to some constructed reality.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think that the power of nationalism is it doesn't seem constructed, right? It seems like it's deeply embedded in who you are as a human being. You grow up with these texts, you grow up with this idea. It also, the nation state still, your citizenship or lack thereof really structures your life from a very early age on. And if you don't think about IDs, I think that, if you're stateless and if you don't have an ID, you realize how important nation states are. You realize that without having that entity to vouch for you, you can't go to school, you can't get a job, you can't travel, you can't do anything, you can't move, and you can't be where you are. Right? So in many ways, like, as much as I'm the one who's kept calling it constructed, right? It's very real. Just because we construct it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel real on an emotional level or have real effects. So a nation state still very much structure the world. I think this idea of values is in some ways it's hopeful, in some ways it's scary, right? So I think that's also, in its more hopeful terms, I think of how excited I am when I get to talk to scholars who work on migration and citizenship, whether it's in Japan. Actually, Japanese Academy is really fantastic, and there's some really amazing scholars who work on Gulf migration. Whether it's in Finland, whether it's in Toronto. So there's something that opens up in me, that is ignited in me when I feel like I meet my common tribe, right? And it's because we're interested in the same kind of problems. We're coming from different parts of the world, but we're really kind of driven by the same passions. And I think that there's so many different kinds of communities like that. Gamers, people who meet across the world and join these teams, Call of Duty and these other games, right? They produce their own kind of community. On the darker side, there's also the terrorist networks that can be very seductive because they are many times critiquing the nation state system and saying, well, this is, a world where we're not divided by these lines, whether they're colonially imposed or otherwise, and instead we're a brotherhood of a common community that isn't determined by these territorial borders. So communities, I think other types of communities are really, really important. Whether they supplant the nation-state system, I think remains to be seen. But I love the way you set it up, because you really don't know who the most powerful brokers or actors in our world are right now. I do think that there are companies that are more powerful than states, and sometimes, not always, and I can't always convince myself of this, but sometimes, especially when I think about things like statelessness and refugee flows, and I think of the fact that a core of sovereignty is the idea that the state has the prerogative to determine who or is or is not a citizen, and who is able to stay in their borders or not. And so if you're someone like me who's interested in refugees and statelessness, the nation states are in many ways the enemy, because it's a man-made problem where we're producing people whose lives cannot live their lives because we're not recognizing their rights. And so moments like that, I think of, well, the private companies that are donating all of this to UNHCR and other humanitarian organizations. Maybe it's like convincing these companies to act in a kind of cohesive way to deal with this problem of displacement. That's going to be the hope. Then you realize, profit maximization is not is not going to lead us to a more equitable world. So I think it's interesting how this generation. I really think about the students I teach, because this generation, they're the first generation to have social media as like middle school. And I think, in some ways that's horrifying. Middle school was traumatizing enough without social media. But, they're so aware of the world, and they're also so aware of its problems. And you can see that weight, realizing that how fast climate change is happening, the anger towards adults who are refusing to look at the science, refusing to believe in facts. That is, I do think that there are these other networks and communities that are emerging that are global, that we absolutely need. So, because any kind of solution to any of the kind of globe's larger structural problems have to come from multiple parts of the world. And it's funny. So I teach in the Pardee School of Global Studies, and our motto, or it's not the motto, I can't think of the right word, but
slogan.
It's the mission. Is advancing human progress, right? And so on the one hand, you can say, well, what does that mean? It means nothing. But in some ways, it's subversive, right? Because it's not national progress; it's human progress, and that's the part I like of what can we do that's sustainable for humans, and actually thinking about the non-human entities in our world too, the animals, etc. Our Earth, but a more kind of inclusive understanding of how to share, and how to think of costs and benefits in ways that aren't just about what is immediately visible to you, because our actions have effects globally. And I think climate change is a perfect example of the kind of downstream effects that other people feel because of actions that are happening totally in one other part of the world. And so any kind of reasonable, any kind of program that is going to have a reasonable possibility of changing any one of those kinds of problems, whether it's global displacement, human trafficking, climate change, has to be more global, has to involve kind of building these kinds of communities in different parts of the world. And so, in terms of thinking, imagining, I'll stop talking and see if you have any.
No. I just want to say something that like, although there's a very clear critique that you present of the nation state system, which I think is I think obvious to many people actually, I don't know, at least people I know maybe.
Yeah.
But then again, when we come to solving it, we're not really structurally solving it, right? Yeah. The nation state is a way of managing larger structures. One example that comes to my mind, and there's a reason why I mentioned the internet for that kind of example earlier, is cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Bitcoin or Ether or any of these other currencies. Like, where do they reside? Everywhere and nowhere, right?
Yeah. As
opposed to the US dollar or the Japanese yen or the euro or wherever, right? It's tied to a geographical location. What I'm trying to say is that, and cryptocurrency became very popular post the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, right? Crash of Lehman Brothers and what happened after that. And the reason this is important is because the nation state system appeared in a time where there was no Apple or companies that are bigger than, or Google or Apple or any of these companies that are like worth hundreds of billions. Now I'm sounding like someone, a political character, that's worth billions of billions, of hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Yeah. Worth trillions altogether. These things didn't exist. The internet didn't exist, right? The ability to move so quickly didn't exist. So, I mean, I think we're being a bit shy in conceiving or imagining a new world, considering all the changes that are there. But, in terms of currency, there are people who were able to conceive that, right? And even payment these days, I mean, we barely carry around cash. Yeah. And now we don't even need to carry our wallets because everything's on our phone, right? So there is a new world that is, the world today is very different in these respects than the world of, let's say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago when the nation state kind of began forming and then strengthening and kind of propagating throughout the world. So that's the angle that I'm kind of looking at it, is that I feel like this is a moment where we really need to think about how we construct our identities and what are the contradictions in the world that we live in today and how it's organized. Which brings me to this question: what is the structure of the world? Like, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, it's not a small question.
No, I mean, but I mean, in the context of what we're talking about, I guess, or.
So I guess I've been very critical of nation states. So let me take a step back and say why they're important. Also, I think if you look at something like, if you look at something like COVID, right, which is an exogenous shock that hits the world almost at the same time around the world and reminds you of just how unequal we are, but also reminds you of how much we need organization, infrastructure, testing, and in that sense you look at what makes a nation state strong. It has nothing to do with how long it's been around, and who offers you security and protection really kind of varies cross-nationally. And so in Bahrain, you can get tests everywhere. You can go through a drive-through. You can buy them, the rapid tests in every pharmacy. I only get tested in the States because I work for Boston University and they built their own testing center. I only have access to healthcare because I have health insurance through my employer, right? So in many ways, my employer structures my life there much more, and especially in terms of benefits, in terms of protections, than the state. Who knows when we're going to get vaccines there? Here, everyone's being vaccinated. They have the options between Chinese and Pfizer. And so, very new nation state, very effective in dealing with a crisis like this one. I think that in some ways, we haven't eliminated the need for protection from violence, right? Being able to not everyone being armed, but having helplines. We haven't dealt with the need for medical care, for other education, other things that we as individuals cannot provide ourselves, even with the internet, right? So there needs to be larger political entities that are producing some of these public goods. They will not be produced just by private entities, but we see really kind of variation in how effective different states are. So on the one hand, I want to kind of make sure I'm managing the critique to also say there are really important uses for nation states and kind of public goods. On the other hand, I think that maybe the size of where we are, it kind of tells you like 1 million people, 1.5 million people, this is a really effective way of managing these questions of scarcity. And so I think that what we're going to see, or what would be a moment of hope, would be for some of the larger nation states seeing more kind of local control, regional control, and not necessarily eliminating any kind of political entities that's there to kind of make these public goods available, because we absolutely need them, right? Not just in these moments of crisis, but these moments of crisis really highlight why we need organization, why we need infrastructure, why we need security, in a way that I think that a completely decentralized world, or one in which we are in many ways really, I mean, our phones, right? All of our data is used for the purposes of profit making. You can talk about something and within a minute, Instagram is advertising it to you, whether or not you even use the search engine. So I think that there's a certain kind of freedom and access to information and access to different communities in different parts of the world, but I do see a dark side to forfeiting and depending on just a handful of companies to provide us with that alternative way of organizing, collectivizing political communities, or just collectivities. You know, they don't have to be political. I always say political because that's what I'm concerned with. It's money, it's power, but any kind of collectivity that yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about, like, I think that, you know, we may be a bit unambitious when it comes to resolving the problems of the nation state. I'm not saying that we should, you know,
eliminate it.
Well, maybe we should. I don't know, but I'm saying I'm not suggesting that we go into chaos and there's no political order. I'm just saying that, is there a different type of political order that is a bit more a bit more useful for the kind of world we live in. Like when the financial crisis happened, the guys who came up with cryptocurrency like Bitcoin and whatnot, they didn't say, oh no, let's eliminate currencies and go back to bartering, or they said, okay, well, what if there's something else that is not centrally controlled supposedly, or what have you. So yeah, I guess I don't know, like. Yeah,
no, I think what you're speaking to is the power of imagination, and the power of imagining a different kind of world. I think that's the first step, right? Yeah. And again, sometimes I have hope for saying, like, okay, well, if we're going to divert power, maybe the power has to be with these, like, there's only a handful of high net worth individuals. Okay, more than a handful, but, a few concentration of financial power. If you convince those people to kind of act collectively, can we have a more kind of global response to some of these larger structural questions? That's one way of reimagining the world. Another way of reimagining the world is to say local, devolve power down, and sort of empower more local, regional entities, and then have a more inclusive understanding of who is part of the we. So it doesn't have to be based on bloodline, it doesn't have to be based on birthright, it doesn't have to be based on your ethnic background or language, but we're going to be part of a community regardless of that. And I think that you actually have both of these reimagined alternatives are kind of happening in different ways. I think, like, maybe I lack the imagination, right? But
it's nothing like that. I'm just kind
I know it's interesting, and I do think that step one is really rethinking what would not necessarily supplant it or take over completely, but what would be more inclusive ways of sharing what we have. And I think, so I'll give you an example of a human being who I think is amazing at reimagining the world. Dr. Susan Ekram, she's an international human rights lawyer at BU. She runs the International Human Rights Clinic there. And what she's been doing and been working on for a very long time with local governments in Spain is to resettle refugees in towns that have all of the youth have left. And so these are aging towns and they desperately need people. And you can see at a national level, this is very difficult. There's all this kind of rhetoric. But then at the local level, people do realize the need that there is land to spare and we actually need people, right? And so that's why I think that I have more hope for devolving power down. And again, it's kind of like, what is that sweet spot of what's the size of a population that is required in order to, you can't go down all the way to the family, right? Because then we're not going to have any of these public goods that we need. But maybe having these much larger entities where people get left out, or you have migrants or stateless populations or refugees who get left out. What's the right kind of size for these reimagined communities that we have?
Okay, so I mean, it doesn't have to be this or that, I think. Like if you look at the EU, right? Eurozone or whatever the official name is. You have the country, so to speak. And then let's take a country like Germany, for example. You have like cantons, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Or regions, if we wish to call it that way. And those have kind of a government. There's probably like a city level government. And then there's the federal government, because I think Germany is a federation, right? Federation of Germany. And then Germany is also a very powerful player in the EU. And so there are these layers that build up to the final, so to speak, official, the final layer that has some level of violence, so to speak, if we are to use that as a measure, which is the EU, or an economic system, economic system, So it doesn't have to be that it's all local, and it doesn't have to be that it's all the region.
Yeah.
It can be those layers, or actually even the US has that. Like you have, I was in Atlanta. So Atlanta, there's the city of Atlanta, but then you have like 4 counties that are kind of overlapping the city of Atlanta, like Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, and what have you, Cobb County. And then you have the state, right? And all these layers have elected officials. And then you have the United States, right? So I think that exists, except the problem then becomes when in enforcing, I don't know, economic power or the power of certain individuals, that they then try to right size it to their appetite. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the EU, because the EU is fascinating. I mean, the EU in many ways has its own international relations, which you really see when it comes to migration policy and in the way that there are now these kind of brokered agreements with Libya, with Tunisia, with Afghanistan, with all these places to say, okay, we're going to give you aid, you stop migrants from coming. So as a collective, right, as a collective, the EU has this power, and it also has, there's really interesting research from EU scholars that show how, the access to the common market becomes this huge carrot. And so you've created, just by collectivizing at that higher level, at that supranational level, you've created a new kind of public good with this common market. Having countries be able to have access to it, gives the EU its own kind of power, right? And we've seen that there are these sort of agreements where the access to the common market is kind of part of those agreements, right? Including in migration enforcement. I think that I'm really interested in passport rankings and what make passports more powerful, less powerful. You realize that I actually have an article that I'm hoping will get published. I've written and revised on how states move up and down these rankings, and a key kind of predictor of whether you're going to move up is whether you can broker an agreement to have access to Schengen, right? And so it kind of shows, and it's because it also has its own kind of soft power. Like Schengen is a really hard. If the EU grants your citizens visa-free access, then other countries countries will follow suit, right? So I think in many ways that this kind of supranational entity has made the EU more competitive with the United States and some of these larger. I mean, the U.S. is in many ways a hegemon. I teach U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and one of the things we debate in the first half of classes is it an empire, and if so, what kind of empire? And it's it's again, like you said, you're absolutely right that this is not just one layer of a political collectivity that's only organized in that layer. You can go all the way down, and you can kind of rise above the nation state too, including when you have military bases all over the world, and you're able to exert that kind of, not necessarily just the act of wars, but just the act of having bases and being able to mobilize forces quickly. That's also part of the U.S. power. It's not just commercial power.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about this, like, when I look at our region, the Middle East, right? I don't necessarily feel very optimistic in certain respects. When you think of the EU, okay, if there's any problem between any two kind of institutions, let's call it a country, let's call it a region, a canton, whatever, it'll get resolved at that higher level, at that higher kind of layer, right? And so the EU has this wide kind of landmass, and within this landmass, within these hundreds of millions of people, will resolve things throughout these layers. But in our region, like, this nation state thing has been deeply problematic.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just use one example of, like, let's say Libya. You have two governments running concurrently there, each with its own elected officials and all that, right? You had Sudan that got, turned into like Sudan and South Sudan. Okay, it has some history, the way it was kind of controlled historically, that, those who were in South Sudan were kind of already their own thing, and then it just got cut, so to speak, into two separate countries. And then you have all these kind of wars happening between these kind of groups or conflicts between different actors in the region. And so that is why, perhaps a transnational approach to the region based on very clear values, because and why I say values is because, again, like, an approach to this was the Arabist kind of movements, right? Al-Uruba and all that. And that had its set of problems. That's why it didn't really technically last that long. But values are clear. Values are immediately redeemable, are immediately justifiable, and hopefully they'd be based on some human kind of intuition or instinct or something that we can more easily, more readily agree on. And the idea is that would progressively eliminate and reduce and eliminate conflict. That shared vision and understanding of the world would create for, maybe certain regions are not as tactful in dealing with COVID, but hey, I mean, the vaccines are coming from there, right? So there must be something good happening there, right?
Yeah.
Putting our minds together, putting our willpower together is a lot more effective and a lot more intuitive, if I'm to use that word, and a lot more congruent with the way the world is organized, like the way investment works these days. I mean, you have investors in Bahrain who have money in Oman or in Tanzania, for that matter. Maybe they own coffee plantations in Yemen, or what have you, or own real estate in London or whatever. It's a lot more congruent with the way the world is organized. But maybe there is a layer that protects that. I don't know.
So, I mean, it's interesting. I wonder if EU scholars would, because I feel like when I talk to my colleagues who work on the EU, they kind of focus on all the dysfunction, right? And with Brexit, but also problem solving and what that means, and burden sharing. And so I think that each region has its own kind of less rosy picture, and obviously the concentration of violence and instability in our part of the world is not something small. And it's not something we can overlook. Whether that's because the nation-state system doesn't work for us, that's where I don't, you know what I mean? So I think in each one of these cases, Iraq, Libya, you're talking about foreign intervention, you're talking about, I mean, immediately from so many different sides, arming different factions. And so essentially what you see there is the inability for one entity to monopolize the legitimate use of violence, right? And I think in that sense, our world here looks very different than if we were Libyan, you know, being in Bahrain. And so, and because we have an entity that has monopolized legitimate use of violence, the UAE, right? And you might have critiques in terms of like, well, what's the foreign policy? Is everyone included? But it isn't all out war because we don't have factions that are warring over the legitimate use of violence that are also getting funded by external actors, right? And so, I mean, even just looking at Turkey's role, Iran's role, all of these regional powers who are playing these, proxy wars outside, right? And so then it becomes a question of, is that because this political system just doesn't work for us as a region, or is it that there's variation in the stability because of also all of these other factors? And one thing I think I really like Waterbury Richard's Political Economy of the Middle East, which actually Ishaq Diwan and Melanie Kamet have revived. They have the new edition, but it's really about the political economy of our region. And I think that if you were to look at sort of one commonality other than Islam, is the way in which in their initial formation, many Middle Eastern states took on a lot of the economic kind of the provision of resources, and for example, under Nasser and others, promising employment, promising this kind of like very large provision of welfare resources that also created people's expectations, that kind of puts these governments in an issue, because then you have an economic crisis that becomes a political crisis, right? Me not getting a job, me being unemployed is because of this leader. And if you think about that versus like Occupy Wall Street, where you have the anger it's not seen as the state's responsibility to provide all of these resources. Instead, it's seen as like, well, these are the banks, that this is what they've done. I think that even looking at a place like Syria, look, climate change and economic crises are deeply embedded in that story, even before talking about, obviously, also the external actors and the political leaders are part of that story, but even thinking about the fact that Syria had the worst drought in recorded history for the 5 years leading up. This led to massive dislocation of youth, a high youth unemployment, up to 85% in some of these cities. It was a tinderbox, right? And so, again, does that mean that the nation-state system doesn't fit Syria because it went back to the mandate system, wasn't organic? No, I think that actually probably thinking about that drought, thinking about unemployment, obviously corruption, etc., it's all part of that story. And I think that we shouldn't group our region, because the grouping doesn't necessarily make sense in that way, right? It was grouped together for political reasons from the outside, embraced for different reasons, the Islam, Arab nationalism. But again, there's so much heterogeneity in how nation states actually operate across our region, that I don't necessarily want to kind of juxtapose us to other parts of the world, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Let me talk about another layer of kind of our relationships to the country, the state, right? So, I want to take the example of someone like Edward Snowden, right? His citizenship was revoked while he was in midair, from Hong Kong to Russia in a layover, heading to somewhere in South America. Now, regardless whether we think he's a hero or a villain, or regardless of that, what he did was, in his opinion, and the opinion of many, perhaps even the U.S. judicial system, because it took on some of the things he said into law, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's still frowned upon, legally speaking.
Yeah.
He did what he did for the better of society and the world at large, right? And serving people, not institutions, not governments, right? The masses, so to speak. That, hey, you guys are being surveilled on, and there's some funky things happening with your data, with your internet, with how you're being, viewed and seen and all that. Yet he's exiled and has an unstable future, and who knows what could happen to him. His future lies in the hands of whoever's president, might want to pardon him or whatever. The question, arises here: what loyalties do we owe the countries that we live in, the institutions that we live in, where here's a person who tried to do something that was good,
mm-hmm.
and yet was exiled and was kind of excluded. So what loyalties do we owe our countries?
Yeah, that's a really actually difficult question. I think that there's an easy answer, which is you owe your country, it should be reciprocal, right? So if you're, and I think that there's a sense of that where people feel that if they're well treated, then they're more loyal. But there's also a sense of wanting to prove your kind of allegiance if you don't have access to full rights. And I think that someone like Snowden, it really becomes a question of like, whose good are you thinking of, and what do you think the right mechanism for that good is, right? And so I think that if you're talking to someone from security apparatus, they might say, well, that's incredibly destabilizing, and there's lots of information that should just not be declassified, right? And we are thinking of the good when we make those decisions about whether something should be classified or declassified, because we're thinking about what kind of information could potentially create violence, create instability. On another side of the spectrum, you might be on the stance of like, no, actually information is the most important thing, and that you should have freedom of information, and thinking about the people is about kind of declassifying this information. So I think that those values really also come back to ways that how we were raised, but also like what the role of the state was in the imaginary, whether you come from military families. I think it was really interesting kind of going to Bahrain school and being around U.S. military families and realizing they had very similar values to my parts of my family who are in the Bahraini military, just very similar values, right? And very different, and that the kids who I grew up with in the U.S. military are very different from didn't have access to the kind of elite circles that I had access to once I was in the United States, at Northwestern, Johns Hopkins, and other places. So it's interesting to what are the experiences that we have that change our understanding of what loyalty means and who's good, or what actions would we take in order to be serving that good. And I think that people ultimately want to do that, right? That you do I don't think there's anyone who, okay, maybe not anyone, but I don't think most people, even people that you completely disagree with, are thinking that they're doing something bad, that they're there to sort of put evil in the world, including people I fundamentally disagree with, like white nationalists, for example. I think that they think that they're doing something good for the world, right? And so it's an interesting question of like what do you owe your state? What kind of loyalty? What does loyalty actually look like? Really kind of varies based on our individual experiences of both privilege and of exclusion.
Right. I think the question that you mentioned, that okay, perhaps white nationalists perceive that they're doing something good for the world or whatnot, or kind of these different groups that we may not necessarily agree with. This is a more existential question, perhaps. Perhaps it's a question where we question whether, is there intuition when it comes to these things? Is there instinct when it comes to these things? Is there something deeper rooted within us or hardwired within us that sees certain things as being more right than others? For example, and I've mentioned this before on this podcast, is that Aristotle in his book of Nicomachean Ethics, like he talks about the centrality of justice, right? And that is the principal value, that is the principal ethic, right? And so that's predicated on this idea that there is something that can be shared among us. But let me ask a different question. If we are to imagine a different world, right? What are the different theories regarding open borders that exist? How do you identify liberal theories of open borders? What do those look like?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting. I think that sometimes when we imagine like a borderless world, it makes it seem that if we just lifted borders, everyone would move. Right? Mm-hmm. And actually moving is very costly. People, there's a lot of forces that are about staying. And I think that obviously there's a sense of adventure, there's a sense of being pulled by a different world, a new world. But a lot of what we see in terms of like bulges of people being caught in places have to do with the erection of borders, rather than this idea that if you removed all these borders, everyone would flood everywhere, right? And so I think like there's very radical notions of a borderless world that have this idea of like, well, any kind of that the earth is a shared kind of good, and that we should share it with everyone. But I think that the fear of that is this idea of like mass migration, mass flows. And I think for those of us who actually study borders and border control and the emergence, you realize these kinds of pockets of mass crises happen when you erect these borders, rather than allowing kind of freedom of movement. In fact, if you think about regional movements, like what we see with the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border, is that there is a much more seasonal movement that stops being able to just kind of continue. And so you're actually pushing people into more permanent forms of migration by erecting those kinds of borders.
Right, because it took us so much effort to cross this.
We're staying. We're staying,
because
right?
Leaving is just like, that's going to be nuts.
And if you think back to, just this idea that there's interesting narratives of some of the business community in Dubai that used to, in the same day, take a boat, go to, Bandar Abbas and come back. In the same evening, right? But now we have this border between Iran and the UAE. Like, that's impossible, right? So there's certain kinds of circular movements that we stop by creating these, boundaries that then create these bulges, which is what constructs those crises. And so, migration crises are very much man-made, and I think that they're an outcome of the specific mechanisms that we're using to enforce and construct these borders, rather than necessarily that if we live in a borderless world, everyone's going to move everywhere and certain places are going to be overwhelmed, right?
And it's interesting because, like, even when I was trying to kind of get my H-1B visa, and then we had this conversation before, is that it was so difficult. Like, it was so costly and difficult for my company to kind of, the company that I used to work for, to kind of bring me in while in Bahrain. Like, you want to employ someone who's outside of Bahrain or not Bahraini. I mean, it's so easy. Like, the system is so kind of quick to process the paperwork and all that, and I think, and I just think how even narratives of immigration and all that in Bahrain, they're seen very differently than.
Well, I think that a key difference is that residency time of residence here does not make you accrue permanent rights, right? So you can live here over generations.
So there's no sensitivity towards it.
There's less sensitivity because you're not opening up, residency does not necessarily open up citizenship, right? Granted, there's now, including H-1B is kind of a hybrid visa, but many U.S. visa categories are non-immigrant visas in which your time spent in the country does not count towards green card or permanent residency and then or citizenship, right? So there's ways of even kind of inclusive immigration systems have created different legal categories for which we suspend the time of people who are there. Students, if you're on an F1 visa, it doesn't matter if you're an F1 for 10 years, you're not actually going to be eligible for permanent residency. You have to be under specific category in order to get permanent residency. But I think that's also why we see more flexibility in terms of like employing foreigners in the Gulf more generally, not just in Bahrain, as opposed to in Europe or the United States, where at least what we saw with the guest worker programs in Europe was that even when workers were supposed to be temporary, the courts played a real role in granting family unification and permanent citizenship rights or permanent residency that eventually turned into citizenship. So I think like in democratic systems, the courts in particular play a role in kind of making migrants have more rights over time, which kind of pushes the sort of challenge to this question of who can enter, as opposed to, well, everyone can enter, but can you really stay?
Right. Okay. And speaking of immigration, on the technological front, right, and this speaks to fluidity. Today we see how people are migrating from one platform to another, right? Like, so based on ethical principles, based on values. And this is a point that kind of Snowden warns us about, how people are migrating from WhatsApp to other platforms like Telegram or Signal or what have you, on the basis of ethical concerns, right? I move from one home to another because we spend so much time on our phones and WhatsApp that that is warranted. So this kind of, again, brings back an idea that we kind of touched on earlier, how in a technological world, perhaps even that idea of the nation state and the idea of the borders, it's a whole different understanding, and how a generation that has seen social media ever since they were very little, perceives the world very differently than ones that didn't live through that, didn't go through that. So Dr. Noora, on a more personal front, like, how did you decide to kind of get into this field anyway?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know why I've always been fascinated with migration. I think it's because I'm from Bahrain,
okay.
And I think that from very early on, this is a very heterogeneous space. Migration is, you grow up with that. And then I had a kind of interest in international human rights law, which I realized after taking my first class was actually refugee law. And that was kind of the hook. And then I was doing a kind of study abroad at Sciences Po, and I ended up taking a class on the EU and the common immigration system there, and that kind of solidified. And so I would say a thread throughout my career has been this interest in migration, also kind of an interest on time. And I think, migration makes you think about time in different ways. Speed of time spent in a country, whether that counts in terms of whether you become a citizen or not. There's different ways of, thinking about how time and migration kind of fit together. And so I think it comes back to Bahrain actually, and growing up here. And like you said, I think that we're lucky for that. I don't think that all of us have a uniform experience in Bahrain. I don't want to whitewash it in that way or Arab wash it, So I think that's important to note. But I think at least the experience I had was one in which you pick up some Tagalog, you pick up some Hindi, you're speaking English,
right.
And it's not a threat to your identity. That's actually a kind of a feeling of like a kinship with all of the people who live in Bahrain. And I think as I've gotten older, I feel that more and more. And I kind of go back and kind of question the own kind of hierarchies we built, or I built in my head about who's, Arab versus Indian versus, and think now, I think of like Bahrainis as being much more inclusive than who holds a passport.
Right. And it's interesting because like even when you watch some of the recent videos that are done by some corporations like Batelco or National Bank of Bahrain or whatever, and they talk about being Bahraini. It's again like speaks to values. Bahraini is someone who's honest, who's like friendly, who you can travel with, who's helpful. Like if your car breaks down, he'll stop and like help you.
Which is true, actually.
Yeah, which is true. Yeah.
For some of us, that is actually the experience that. I remember being a teenager when Sif Mall would first opened, and if anyone harassed, I wouldn't think twice to just look at any Bahraini, person or man or, and just they would intervene, right? There was a sense of security, and that I felt. And again, not to say that that's the experience that all Bahrainis have.
Right. Well, I really appreciate you joining us on this episode of Minwar Podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor having you.
It's mine.
I hope you had the same experience.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. Really, Ali, this was really fantastic.
Great,
Thank you for having me.
For those of us who are watching and listening, please do follow Dr. Noora on her Twitter accounts at Noora, NOORALORI. And be sure to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, or the platform you use to follow your favorite podcasts. And do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Share this episode with anyone who may be interested in the depth of our conversations and questions as we aim for a better understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We'd be delighted to hear from you and know your opinions of the episode or the podcast, any suggestions you have for guests, people we should be hosting. So do email us on minwar.podcast@gmail.com. We thank Hassan Haddad for the podcast's music, and many thanks to all of you listening and watching from our team: Jalal Jaziri, Hassan Salman, Baqir Ghazi, Hawra Abdullah, and myself, Ali Lori. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Noora.
Thank you.